So it's been a while since I've put up a video on feminism, and I'd like to get back into this and start producing a few more. At this point in time, most of my videos have been, fairly general in their content. They've been discussing, general concepts within feminism. And I'd like to start to transition to discussing more specific topics, but there is one more video I'd like to make that's, relatively broad in its scope. And that has to do with the current state of gender in society. I think it's worthwhile to reflect upon what's happening in society when it comes to gender, in part because gender is one of those very central concepts to feminism. And by examining this, it also gives us a sense of the impact that feminism is having on the world, as well as it can also, offer a bit of context to understanding specific things that are happening in the news with regards to gender. So this is going to basically outline 7 different things that at least I've noticed happening with regards to gender in society. And again, hopefully it'll paint sort of a broad picture of some of the big shifts or some of the bigger changes that are happening nowadays. Obviously, just a brief disclaimer, this video is going to be very limited in its scope. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details of a lot of the changes that are happening. So, just bear that in mind. This is going to be a pretty quick overview. But again, hopefully we'll at least paint a broad picture of some of the big changes that are happening. And again, give people a sense of what's going on. So the first change that I've seen is that gender is starting to be seen as something which is harmful. For example, some have highlighted the negative impact that gender stereotypes can have on people. And they've even pointed out that sometimes its impact can be somewhat different depending upon whether we're talking about girls or boys. Others focus on certain aspects of gender. So for example, with toxic masculinity, this is a term that at least some would define as referring to cultural or traditional expectations for men and how they're supposed to act. It deals in part with what it means to be a real man, but with a specific focus on the traits or the characteristics that can ultimately be harmful. Basically, people are saying that certain masculine characteristics can have a negative impact, not just on men, but also on women and on society at large. This has been blamed for a number of different things. So, for example, you can find articles linking toxic masculinity to destroying the planet, sexual assault, mass shootings, and even the alt-right has been blamed as well. With that said, it's worthwhile to be aware that even more positive traits have been critiqued. Some articles discuss this concept of benevolent sexism, which refers to attitudes that view men and women in very stereotypical ways, in stereotypical roles. But what's important to sort of highlight about this is that they can often feel, or it often feels, somewhat positive, and they can often paint men and women in somewhat complementary ways. So, for example, the idea that women are perhaps more kind, compassionate, and nurturing, whereas men are more rational, less emotional, perhaps somewhat stoic. And although this may seem, somewhat harmless, there have been those who suggest that this type of sexism can be just as oppressive as more hostile forms of sexism. The main point here is just to point out that gender is sort of starting to be seen rather than as something that's good and beneficial, as something that's harmful, that's limiting, and as something that's restricting to people. And this can generate a degree of dissatisfaction with the status quo, and then that can then provide the grounds for change. And that brings us to the second point, that we're starting to see people sort of break away from the gender roles that society has. People are starting to deviate from the gender norms, and we're departing from this idea that men and boys are supposed to act one way and girls and women are supposed to act another way. For example, you can find a number of instances where men are starting to deviate from norms. This can be seen in the increased interest that men are having in makeup. Men are getting more involved in parenting, especially when it comes to getting more involved in childcare. And even when it comes to toys, I know there was an article discussing how dolls were being made for boys now. When it comes to women, I think sports is a good illustration of some of the changes that have been happening. Women have been getting more involved in things like MMA, wrestling, weightlifting, powerlifting, again, activities which are typically seen as masculine and which are definitely more male dominant. Now, it's probably also worthwhile to point out that there is, I guess you could say, a scientific shift, which is sort of occurring at the same time. Granted, this is a bit controversial, but there are those who are arguing that, biologically speaking, there is no sort of essential hardwired difference between, say, the male brain and the female brain. And you can see how this sort of shift in the scientific understanding can then provide the grounds for a lot of what we see happening at the social level. Once you start to question this idea that, men are naturally one way and women are naturally another way, then it makes sense for people to become more accepting of those who sort of deviate from society's norms, and perhaps it may make sense to even encourage people to deviate from those norms. I think it's probably also worthwhile to add that, it's worthwhile to consider why support for this has been growing. And I think one big reason why is because there genuinely have been a number of instances where people have been mistreated for sort of breaking out of the rigid gender stereotypes that they're expected to conform to. So, for example, Aly Raisman, who was a gymnast, she was an Olympian in 2016. I'm not sure if she's still competing. I don't really follow gymnastics, but the point is she actually came out and shared the story from when she was younger about how she used to be bullied because her arms were too muscular. Likewise, you can find a story about a young boy who had his arm broken because I think he was on the cheerleading team or something like that. So again, you can see instances where people, again, have paid a price for sort of deviating from social norms. And I think a lot of people are starting to realize that this really isn't the way we should treat people and that we should be more accepting of people. And this is just not the way that we want to conduct our society. A third big shift that's occurring is people are starting to question what determines gender. There are different ways of thinking about this topic, but one way is by sort of outlining a traditional view which sees gender as something which is determined by physical characteristics. So in this scenario, parents may say, look at an ultrasound, or they may wait till their baby is born, and then they may, based upon certain physical characteristics, identify the baby as a girl or a boy, and then raise the child accordingly. But transgender people are sort of starting to question this approach. They're starting to sort of question this understanding. These are people who identify as a gender which differs from the sex they were identified as at birth. At least that's one way of thinking about them. And from this perspective, gender is more so about one's internal sense of self. And that implies that it's determined more so by a sort of subjective psychological state. Now, what this implies is that you cannot know someone's gender simply based upon observing relatively fixed biological or physical characteristics. I say relatively fixed just because obviously with surgery and things like that, you can modify your body to some extent. Now, this can have I guess you could say this shift can have an influence on how you answer a number of different questions. So, for example, what bathrooms are you allowed to use? What sports teams can you play on? What pronouns do we have to use when interacting with people? Are these things dictated more so by certain biological characteristics, or are they determined more so by one's internal sense of self? Fourth, people are starting to question how many genders there are. And to some extent, this sort of goes to show that once you start to change how gender is determined, there can be a ripple effect in other areas as well. If it is the case that gender is determined by one's internal sense of self, then it doesn't seem as if there's any real reason for there to only be two genders. There's no need to limit the number of genders to simply two. Instead, many gender possibilities are on the table for people to choose from and for people to discover, and for people to identify as. And this line of thinking is actually reflected in the way that Facebook has allowed people to identify in their Facebook profile. You're allowed to choose a gender if you want to, and they have a male option, they have a female option, but then they also have a customize option. And this basically allows you to type in whatever gender you want. Again, in line with this idea that we're not going to restrict people to just two genders. Many other genders are possible. Fifth, I should say we're starting to also consider whether or not gender is constant. The traditional view is that the gender that you were is the gender that you are, which is the gender that you will be. But once we start to say that gender is determined more so by one's internal sense of self, then all of a sudden we have to be open to the possibility that if your internal sense of self changes, then your gender identity will change as well. And this gives rise to this idea of gender fluidity. For someone who's gender fluid, gender is not about just being a male or just being a female. These things can actually change. You can be multiple genders throughout the day. It's again a very fluid kind of identity, which again, if you accept that gender is more so a matter of one's internal sense of self, then this line of thinking seems to logically follow. Sixth, we see a rise in gender neutrality. And I kind of see this to some extent as the practical application of a lot of the changes that we're seeing in how we think about gender. This is sort of the way we bring about the changes that we want to see when it comes to gender. And one example of gender neutrality can be seen in the way that parenting is being done by a lot of people. There are a lot of parents who are choosing to not identify their children as a boy or a girl. It's simply just a boy. And the idea behind this is that they don't want to impose a gender upon their child. Rather, the child's gender is for the child to determine on their own. And of course, that will just happen with time. When they raise their child, they may expose their child to different toys, different haircuts, different clothing styles, lots of different options. And again, they don't want to sort of treat the child differently based upon the way a girl is supposed to act, or based upon what a boy is supposed to be interested in. In some instances, they may not even reveal sort of the physical sex, so to speak, to other people, because they don't want perhaps the biases that people have to influence the way that they treat the child. Sometimes people may treat a girl differently than a boy, and they want to insulate their child from, again, those sort of cultural biases that people may have. Another area that we've seen gender neutrality starting to become, an issue is with ID cards. Not too long ago, Canada actually administered a gender-free ID government card, or rather, I should say, a genderless ID card. And it was, instead of, I'm not sure what the alternative is if they use MF. I'm assuming that's what it is for male and female. But this had the letter U on it, which, from what I've read, could refer to a number of different things, whether it's unknown, unspecified, undetermined. But the main point behind this, again, is driven by this idea that we can't know what the child's gender is simply by looking at it. Rather, we have to let the child let us know what gender it is, going back to this idea that gender is determined more so by one's internal sense of self. And this whole push for gender-free ID cards is actually, I guess you could say, part of a broader movement that some organizations have been pushing for. It's, I think, part of the agenda of an organization called the Gender-Free ID Coalition, which kind of wants to remove gender from ID cards in general. Other areas that have been influenced by gender neutrality are also names. You have names which may not necessarily be associated with boys or girls, gender-neutral clothing, gender-neutral toys, bathrooms, and so on. And then finally, the seventh point deals with gender abolition. And this kind of gets down to a very fundamental question of whether gender should even exist in the first place. Some think that it should be removed altogether, and to some extent they may think or view gender as a way of categorizing people that sort of creates, I guess, a way to distinguish between groups, and then based upon that distinction, you can then treat groups differently. So it's like, okay, we're going to divide society into men and women, and then we're going to impose these gender roles upon them. And in so doing, we can sort of create almost like a hierarchical system that creates an unequal distribution of power. And again, for them, gender functions more so as a tool of oppression, a tool for some groups to maintain power over others, a tool to sort of promote inequality, things like that. And of course, from their perspective, the solution to a lot of the problems that we see with gender is not so much to tweak it and to modify it within society, but rather to get rid of it altogether. My sense is that this view isn't incredibly popular, and it seems to be criticized from a number of different angles. But nevertheless, it does get down to sort of a deeper question. What's really wrong with gender in society? Is it how gender is manifested, or is it more so with the mere fact that gender even exists? So that's pretty much it for this video. Again, hopefully this was at least a useful sketch for giving you a sense of some of the things that are happening with gender, and again, providing some context when you hear about something in the news that deals with sort of the debates and the controversies that surround gender. Again, wasn't able to go into a lot of detail into some of these views, and I may have left some details out. Some of the points I made may have been a bit debatable, but the general sketch I think is at least worthwhile to, I guess you'd say, keep in mind when you're trying to get a sense of what's going on in society. Again, just to reiterate, viewing gender as something that's negative or that's harmful, breaking away or breaking out of gender stereotypes, questioning what determines gender. I think that's a key one. And obviously, once you change what determines gender, you're kind of playing around with the very definition of gender itself. And then, of course, that can give rise to, how many genders there are, whether or not gender is constant. And those ideas can then promote this idea of gender neutrality. And then finally, of course, there are some people who are perhaps a little bit more on the extreme, quote unquote, end of the spectrum, and then they may want to just remove gender from society altogether. So again, that's pretty much it. Nothing too I guess crazy here. Just again reporting on some of the things that I've observed, and hopefully this again gives you a bit of context when getting a sense of some of the things that go on in the news with regards to gender. So that's pretty much it for this video. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.